In my first video in this series, I talked about the Medium Tank M4A2 or the Sherman V. This was a tank that was used both by Soviet and British Commonwealth forces, and not surprisingly, both of these nations experienced the exact same problems with it. Now, it was a good tank, obviously, but it did have some drawbacks, and not surprisingly, the drawbacks experienced by British, Canadian, and Soviet troops were exactly the same. There was another tank, in fact another Sherman variant even, that both the Soviets and the British used, and so I figured I should probably cover that as well separately. This is the M4A4, or the Sherman V in British parlance. Now, the Soviets did not, spoiler alert, they did not end up ordering this tank in great numbers. They only ordered two, but they still ran into trials, and I thought it would be interesting to compare what the British and the Soviets thought about the medium tank M4A4. Quick reminder of what a M4A4 actually is and why it was built. So in 1941, the Americans wanted to build tons and tons of medium tanks. Unfortunately, their ability to produce tanks outpaced their ability to produce engines. The R975 Wright, and then later Continental engine, was just not available in sufficient numbers to power this huge production of war machines, and so the Americans needed to find out other sources of engines. So the M4A2 is actually a product of that program. They didn't have a diesel engine sufficiently powerful to power a medium tank, but they had one that was half as powerful, and so simply taking two engines and sticking them together was enough to produce an engine for a medium tank. So in 1941, Chrysler also got this objective to build a tank engine. Chrysler, being an automotive company, didn't really have anything as powerful as even half of a tank engine, but they did have a pretty good design already, which was a six-cylinder inline engine that they used for their cars. And sure, one of them's not powerful enough to power a tank, and two aren't, and three aren't, but if you staple five of these engines together to make this 30-cylinder monstrosity, well, that is powerful enough to power a tank. Yes, it was bigger than any of the Sherman engines up to that point, but you could just enlarge the Sherman slightly, elongate it, and, well, it works. The problem, of course, is that this composite engine, it was weaker than other Sherman engines, and elongating the Sherman, of course, made it heavier, and as a result, the mobility characteristics were not as good. If you give a heavier tank a weaker engine, obviously it won't go as fast. The advantage of the Chrysler engine was quantity. So Chrysler could build 80 of these per day, while Continental could only make 15 radial engines. And so if the Americans wanted their medium tank program to have the volumes that they needed, well, they had no other choice, and so this engine was accepted into service as the A57 Chrysler Multibank. The Sherman tank that used the Chrysler Multibank was standardized under the designation M4A4. So the Red Army learned about the medium tank M4A4 in September of 1942. When a Soviet delegation toured the Detroit tank arsenal, they were shown this tank and told about how, well, we don't have any M4A2s for you, but we do have this other tank. Sure, it has this gasoline engine, which Soviets weren't thrilled with, but it could use a lower octane grade than American radial engines, so that was a little bit better in that respect. But most importantly, they could be delivered in great quantity. Now, the Soviet delegation, having examined the tank and seen it drive around, concluded that it was worse than the T-34 and even the KV. Their words, not mine. And, well, but even that kind of tank is better than no tank at all. So they reached a middle ground. Two of these M4A4 tanks would be sent to the USSR for evaluation, and then after trials were conducted, then they would make a decision whether or not to send this tank in larger numbers. As for the British, I actually haven't been able to establish when exactly the British found out about this tank, but I did find out when the Canadians found out about it, actually also in September of 1942. A Department of Munitions and Supply Intelligence summary reads, "The quintuplant engine has 5 Plymouth engines attached to one driving gear. This was made by the Chrysler Corporation, admittedly as a makeshift, as these engines were available at once in great quantities. On the best engineering advice it could obtain some months ago, it was unlikely to be a success. On the contrary, it has apparently been successful, but the problems of maintenance in the field are obviously very great, and I have not pressed for this engine." As you can see, the first impressions for this tank weren't all that favorable when it came for the Canadians either. But let's go back to the Soviets. The first 2 M4A4s took their time and only arrived through Iran in the spring of 1943. There turned out to be a couple more differences between the M4A4 and the M4A2 than just the engine. For one, the M4A4 had a new electric third traverse mechanism. This would be the Westinghouse. And the tracks were also different. Rather than using a smooth rubber T41s, they actually had rubber chevron T54s, which the Soviets were quite excited about, since one of the biggest disadvantages of the M4A2 was its poor off-road performance. Now, these two features weren't exclusive to the M4A4. You could put any kind of Sherman track onto any other kind of Sherman, and you can put the Westinghouse third traverse motor on any other Sherman, but these were just the first models of the Sherman that the Soviets saw that had them. So while the Soviets didn't get their M4A4s until the spring of 1943, the British had actually started receiving them in November of 1942, even though, despite the initial protests. Now, interestingly enough, they did not conduct detailed reliability trials until April of 1943, so the Soviets and the British were actually testing their M4A4s out roughly around the same time. There were a few differences in these trials as well. The Soviets had 2 M4A4s that were allocated for testing, the British had 3. The Soviets had a 2,000-kilometer test track. The British had a 2,000-mile test track, which of course is 3,200 kilometers, so 1.5 times longer. In Soviet hands, the M4A4 turned out to be considerably slower than the M4A2. While Soviet testers could accelerate the M4A2 to a whopping 50 kilometers per hour, the maximum speed for the M4A4 was just 40 kilometers per hour. When it came to average speed, the difference was not as great, but still noticeable. The average speed of the M4A2 on the highway was 40 kilometers per hour, and for the M4A4, it was only 33. The biggest complaint actually wasn't about speed, but rather fuel expenditure. The Medium Tank M4A4 consumed a whopping 309 liters of gasoline per 100 kilometers of highway driving. And that's highway driving. That's actually more than the M4A2 burned off-road. On a country road, the M4A2 burned 246 liters per 100 kilometers. The M4A4 actually burned more than twice as much at over 500 liters per 100 kilometers. These were fuel economies of a heavy tank, not a medium one, and the Red Army was quite disappointed with this performance. The only saving grace was that no engine troubles were encountered, unlike the early M4A2s, which had their share of problems with diesel engines. I actually couldn't find any British fuel economy trials, but I did find American ones. In American trials, the M4A4 was also the hungriest out of all the Sherman tanks. The fuel expenditure was 0.66 miles per gallon on a highway, or 0.29 miles per gallon cross country. If you convert it into liters per 100 kilometers, these are actually worse figures than what the Soviets got, so this was a very fuel inefficient tank. On the other hand, I did find British reliability trials, and the engines did not do so hot there. All 3 engines under trial showed a severe loss of power after driving for 1,000 miles, although only one of the engines broke completely. Due to damage to the lubrication system, the number 4 bank on one of the engines broke. However, the British did point out that the tank could still drive around with 1 out of its 5 engine banks broken, but this was not a huge saving grace. They did point out that the Chrysler multibank was the least reliable of all of the Sherman engines. The problem with these engines was, again, not so much the reliability as it was the amount of maintenance that had to go in them. The Canadians straight up state, "We do not wish the Chrysler on any account because of the difficulties of maintenance." Just like the Soviets, the Canadians ranked the M4A2 with its diesel engine first, then the M4A3. The Soviets never got an M4A3, so I have nothing to compare it with, unfortunately. And then the M4A4 was dead last among all the Sherman types. It's worth noting that hydrostatic lock, which was a major issue with using M4A4 Shermans in the field, did not actually crop up in any of these trials. In addition to defects with the engine, the British did write a lot about defects with the running gear and the suspension, which makes sense since the tank did grow quite a bit heavier. As with the engines, most of the failures occurred after the 1,000-mile mark. Over the next 1,000 miles, there were 15 failures of bogie bearings, 9 failures of suspension springs, and then various other miscellaneous bits and bobs that broke, including the welding on the bogies. After 1,000 miles of operation, the drive sprockets and tracks also had to be swapped out. This, in part, was exacerbated by driving fast, and the British actually instituted a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit. So maybe that's why they never tried out the maximum speed, because if you drive around at the maximum speed, your tank will just fall apart. When it comes to the armament, the Soviets actually didn't do particularly thorough trials. To them, the armament was exactly the same as it was on the M4A2. They do point out that the sights are likewise unsatisfactory, particularly because of very poor sight markings. But aside from that, there was not really a detailed evaluation of the gun. The British weren't huge fans of American sights either, either their design or their position inside the tank. There was mention of some work I saw about replacing these sights with British-made ones. Now, I know they did this for the Firefly because of that a British gun. I'm not sure if they ever did this for 75mm Shermans. The British also noticed that the opening for the sight was actually too big. There was an unfortunate tendency for rain, debris, or even enemy bullets to make it through. There were various solutions that were proposed by British troops, including one that just wanted to put an armored plug over that whole opening that you could pull out before the battle, but I don't think any of those were implemented either. As for the other vision devices, the Soviets had the exact same complaint as they had for the M4A2, which is that their vision sideways was pretty poor. Now, I was not able to find an evaluation that the British had in terms of the Sherman's observation devices, but I think that the fact that they started putting their own all-around vision cupolas on Shermans does suggest that they were not satisfied with the American design. The Soviets found the Westinghouse turret turret mechanism actually to be better than the hydraulic one. Unfortunately, I don't know if it was an oil gear or Logansport that was used on earlier Soviet Shermans. The British, on the other hand, didn't quite like the Westinghouse that much. It was jerky in operation. It had a lot of problems turning the turret when the tank was tilted to its side. But both the Soviets and the British liked the ability of the commander to actually traverse the turret on his own. So if he sighted a target, he could turn the turret to point the gun towards it, and then the gunner could do the fine adjustments to actually get the gun on target. The British ranked the Westinghouse turret traverse second of the three, behind the oil gear, but better than the Logansport. Unfortunately, I don't know which turret traverse mechanism the early Soviet Shermans had. If it was the Logansport, then the two evaluations would agree. So while we're on the subject of weapons, there is one thing that I probably should have mentioned in my previous video, but since it's not specific to any model of Sherman, I can mention it here. The 50 cal, the M2 Browning machine gun that was on top of the turret, fired by the commander. Both the Soviets and the British agreed that it was a great weapon. However, the mounting left very much to be desired. For one, there wasn't really any comfortable place to sit while operating the gun. Additionally, the gun just kind of sat directly on top of the hatch, and it got in the way when you wanted to use the hatch without using the gun. And then, since on early Shermans this was the only hatch in the turret, it could actually impede evacuation, since all three crew members would have to wrangle their way past the gun on their way out of the tank. So both the Soviets and the British liked the gun, but hated how it was installed. The Soviets actually recommended only leaving 150 cal per platoon, since that was sufficient for protection of the whole tank column from the air. The British just wanted to take all the guns down and put them on trucks. Now, I know the Americans replaced this gun mount later on with one where you could stand on the engine deck and fire the gun that way, but this evaluation only covers the earlier version where you had to kind of semi-sit in the turret to use it. So the Soviet conclusion overall was that the Sherman M4A4 was largely equivalent to the M4A2 in things like comfort, vision, and armament, but the engine and therefore mobility were so bad that, well, that failed the tank outright. The Red Army preferred to wait for the M4A2 rather than accept the M4A4. As I mentioned before, the British did end up taking the M4A4. Unlike the Soviets, whose tank industry had largely regained its footing by 1943, the British weren't as lucky. And so, well, beggars can't be choosers. They did have to take on this tank. To their credit, they used it quite a lot in great numbers. The later the war went, the more favorable the reviews actually became, in part because the Americans, Chrysler, did have their representatives in touch with the end users. They did implement their feedback into production. The M4A4 did get better as time went on, and the British did do a modernization program on their own. There were little things that maybe wouldn't even have come up during regular trials. For example, one that comes to mind is on the M4A2, there was a little kind of indentation where you could put your foot and rest your foot while you're driving. On the M4A4, that wasn't there, which caused the drivers to ride the clutch, which you really shouldn't do. So you could weld on an additional plate as a footrest at a workshop, but ideally you want, when you're buying all these tanks, you want them to already come to you with all these quality of life changes. Even when admitting that the Sherman V was a good tank, the British do say that it's not as good as the Sherman III, and well, it appears that even by the end of the war, the engine problems were never fully resolved. Despite gradually improving evaluations, the M4A4 was sort of a black sheep of the Medium Tank M4 family. From the beginning, it was pretty clear that this was a temporary substitute, and, well, nothing lasts forever. On October 10th, 1943, production of the Medium Tank M4A4 ceased. This is the first of the Sherman variants to be taken out of production, and the M4A4 never received such significant improvements as the 76mm gun, HVSS suspension, wet ammo rack, and other big modernizations to the Sherman that made it a much more potent vehicle in the battlefield.